Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. There's a lot of ways that tragic or terrifying events can come to be, each forming their own stories. Sometimes lives are affected in various ways and for various reasons. Sometimes these experiences are likely avoidable. We make a stupid mistake or poor decision, one that potentially bears lifelong consequences, or ones where we're just lucky we made it out alive. Other times, events, experiences are completely unavoidable, almost as if some larger force was at play. The outcome and experience are practically destined to be. And of course, there are times that these events, terrifying experiences, don't even have to happen to you personally in order for you to be affected, in order for you to learn something. So, let's get started, shall we? So, first of all, please excuse my ignorance with certain matters, but I'm desperate for answers. I've never really been into scary stuff at all, so I've never browsed these topics, but I'm hoping someone has an idea of what I saw. In case it matters, I'm a 23-year-old female, and I just moved to Oregon 6 months ago. I'm originally from Maine, so obviously that's been an adjustment, but in a good way. I love my new home and job. I've made amazing friends, and I'm dating someone new. But then there's this other thing. Well, first, before you suggest it, you should know that I've never had any mental health issues. I've never been depressed or overly anxious. If anything, I had the most normal, boring life you could possibly imagine, until recently. I live in a semi-wooded but suburban area. I have neighbors, but we have a small stretch of woods between us. We aren't exactly far apart, but we aren't on top of each other either. I decided to plant a few flower beds in a small garden in the backyard, which obviously required spending a significant amount of time outside. It was never a problem to work during the day, but as it grew darker, I would hear something moving around in the woods. It sounded too heavy to be a raccoon or anything like that, so I thought it was one of my neighbors, and that kind of freaked me out, especially since the later it got, the closer it seemed to come. That part really freaked me out, so I started gardening as early as possible, but my work schedule wasn't always very sensitive to this necessity. Even so, I got it done, and my garden grew just fine. The first time I actually laid eyes on the thing making all of this noise was a couple of days before the first tomatoes would be ripe enough to pick. I had been excited about the prospect, and as a result found myself staring through the patio doors more and more. Except, on this night, something else was back there too. At first I wasn't sure what I was seeing, so I turned on the floodlights, but then I couldn't believe what I was seeing. In the middle of my backyard was an extremely pale humanoid figure, crouched down on all fours, but it looked to be about the size of a large man. It had no nose, no mouth, but there was a shining green eye in the center of its forehead, with two more on either side of its head. Maybe they weren't eyes, but they were glowing. I've never been so terrified in all of my life. I called 911 and got as far as, "Help, there's a..." before realizing what I would sound like if I told the truth. Ultimately, I worried they wouldn't send anyone if it sounded like a prank, so I said there was a strange man in a mask crouched in my backyard. I desperately wished for it to be the truth, but I just didn't see how any human's arms could be that long. I hid in a closet until the police arrived. They searched the woods around my house, but whatever I'd seen was gone. The officer said it was probably just a neighborhood kid fooling around, and to call back if I saw anything else. Well, there wasn't anything else until 3 nights later. I was sleeping, but the sound of the squeaking floor began to seep into my dreams, and the long creak of the bedroom door brought me back to reality. I didn't move at first. My mind was too foggy to immediately comprehend the danger behind such sounds, but my eyes soon shot open with the harsh realization, and I screamed at the sight before me. The creature was standing in my doorway, just watching. It didn't move, and neither did I. Aside from being frozen with fear and shock, I also worried it might charge at the first sign of any disturbance. I'm not sure what time it was when this happened, so I can't say for sure how long we stayed like that, but it was almost 4 a.m. when the thing finally left. It backed out into the hallway without ever taking its eyes away from me, and I listened as it made its way out the door. Ever since that night, I've kept everything locked and placed a burglar bar on my sliding glass door. So far, it hasn't gotten back inside, but I've seen it in my yard twice since then. The last time was just 2 nights ago, and I know it's going to keep coming back. I also know I sound like a lunatic, but I have no clue what I should do next. Can anyone help me? I wasn't sure before about changing the names, but I figured it's probably more respectful to do so yes, names have been changed in this story. This is on behalf of my father, and retells of his time spent with Mr. Jerry G before his sudden passing. In 2012, my dad Nate was a pastor at a church that Jerry and his wife had attended for years. Nate and Jerry had become good friends since he'd taken over as head of the ministry in our small Christian church. Just after the summer of 2012, Jerry pulled Nate aside after a morning service. He'd tell him that something evil had entered his property. Jerry owned a farm and cared for several huge adult sows and a boar named Teddy. The previous night, Jerry had walked down to lock up the barn. He said that he was there and the doors were already closed. He thought it was strange because there are 2 big, heavy wooden doors, and the wind that day wasn't nearly enough to be able to move them around, let alone shut both. With more caution now, Jerry approached the barn, opened one of the doors, just enough so he could see in. The pigs were hiding together up against the chicken wire, trying to get as far away as they could from something. Even the boar was cowering away. Most of the hogs on the farm are over 700 pounds, and to see them struck with such terror gave Jerry genuine goosebumps on his arms. When he fully opened the door, nothing was in the enclosure with the pigs. Jerry said all the lights in the barn were off, and he thought the lights had burnt out. But the next morning, when he'd go back out to the barn to feed the pigs, he noticed glass littered all around the enclosure. With the light of the morning sun casting in, Jerry could see all of the lights in the barn had been smashed. The metal saucers that would typically hold these halogen bulbs were bent, like someone had struck them vertically with a bat. These lights are also hanging 15 or so feet off the ground. Jerry would spend from dusk till dawn that day cleaning the pig enclosure and staring at the bent, misshapen light fixtures, wondering how this physically could have happened. Before leaving church, Jerry thanks my dad for his time and requests that he keeps their conversation between the 2 of them. Nate agrees, and they part ways. It's only a few days until they have an opportunity to catch up. Tuesday, the church held a brunch for the veterans and servicemen. My dad knew he'd see Jerry and be able to ask him how things were going. But what he didn't expect was tears to form in his eyes when he responded to the question. He tells my father that he thinks he's losing his mind. He says, quote, "I show up here looking for God, but God's not looking for me." My father, Nate, takes Jerry into a more private area of the church so he can elaborate further as to what's been happening the past few days. He tells Nate that the Sunday they'd spoken, when Jerry got home, he pulled onto the gravel of his driveway, and Teddy the boar was running down the gravel stretch toward the truck. Jerry laid on his horn and scared it to start running in another direction besides the open gate entrance to the farm. When the boar turns, Jerry jumps out of his truck and shuts the gate again. Then he hops back in his truck and speeds to the barn with the pig enclosure. As Jerry made his way toward the barn, it was clear to see that one of the doors were wide open. A few of the other hogs had also escaped and were running around in the grass, squealing like all hell. When Jerry pulls up and shines his headlights into the barn doors, what he saw was a woman hanging inside the pig enclosure. The sight made his heart skip a beat, but when he pulled his keys from the truck's ignition, the headlights turned off, and the woman was no longer there. But he could see now, both gates in the pig enclosure had been opened. One pig remained inside. Jerry thought it was dead. Its eyes were opened but glazed over, and there was a trail of blood that slowly leaked from its snout. But when he checked for a heartbeat, he was astonished to hear it beating normally. No amount of pushing or pulling could get this hog out of its trance. Odd behavior like this in farm animals usually means death is around the corner for them anyways, so Jerry would leave feeling terrible, thinking he'd have to be making arrangements for his pig that afternoon. Jerry rounds up all of the other hogs who had escaped and by this point had already reached the furthest corners of his property. When all of them were accounted for, Jerry goes back to check on the pig he'd originally found by itself. It's moved, and by following a trail of blood, he spots a big hog standing with its head against one of the barn walls. This is when Jerry would grab Nate and with true sincerity in his voice tell him that the pig was speaking words. Not grunts or low oinks that could have been mistaken for words, but actual sentences. Then it collapsed again. Jerry didn't wait for it to get back up. When he got back to the truck, he'd grab a big sack of pig food, cut a hole in the middle, and thrown it into the enclosure before locking up. The next morning, when Jerry opens up the barn doors, the pig that gave him a scare is up, acting perfectly fine. He noted that there wasn't even a bloodstain on its nose or skin. Nate asks if he'd like assistance from the church to bless his property, but Jerry refused. The last thing they said to each other was that they would see each other on Sunday. Sadly, that meeting would never take place. Thursday of that week, Nate receives a call from one of the church members telling him that Jerry had passed away. Nate asks what happened, and she doesn't have many answers. A family member says that they were over to visit on Wednesday when he'd left to go feed the hogs, but he never returned. Hours would pass by before the family member would set out on a search for him. They'd find Jerry's dentures and pieces of his body in the pig enclosure. Most of his remains had been consumed. Over the next few days, my dad would read the newspapers that pathologists were unable to identify a cause or manner of death, stating that it's possible he could have had a heart attack or been knocked over by one of his animals before being killed and eaten. Personally, diving more into this story, I'd also find a quote from DA Paul Frazier saying, "For all we know, it was a horrific accident, but it's so doggone weird that we have to look at all possibilities." I've always been curious if Jerry ever told anybody else about what was happening on his property. Would it have changed things? Probably not, right? Regardless of circumstances, Jerry still passed in a horribly sad way, and my prayers go out to his family. Tonight I had Cinnamon Toast Crunch for dinner. I set the bowl, milk, and cereal onto my table, and then returned to the kitchen for the spoon I'd forgotten. None were in the drawer. The next place I looked was the dishwasher and noticed it hadn't been started yet. So I grabbed a spoon from the silverware rack in the dishwasher and washed it by hand with a sponge. When I was satisfied it had been thoroughly cleaned, I returned to the table. But when I'd gotten there and sat down, there was now a knife in my hand instead of a spoon, even though the spoon had never left my grasp from the sink to the table. Somehow, when I sat down, it was a butter knife that I was holding. It's one that I haven't seen before either. Me and my roommate only have a couple sets of dishes, and none of our utensils have wooden handles. I'm kind of freaking out because I'm literally losing my mind with how absolutely sure I was that I had a spoon, only to have what falls from my palm be a butter knife we don't own. Could someone please explain this? I don't know where else to ask for advice about what just happened. If anyone's got any answers, I'll be up late tonight, eagerly waiting. I got a real lesson when it came to stealing. I used to stay at my Aunt Jenny's place once in a while to have a sleepover with my cousin Davy. My mom and Aunt Jenny weren't very good friends, but both my mom and Jenny, her sister, my aunt, got pregnant around the same time, so Davy and I had been best friends since birth, and we'd lived close to each other, all the way up until Jenny got a job further from town, didn't want to spend the money on gas to work and back every day. A few months into our 5th grade year, she pulled him out and enrolled him into another school in another district far from mine. Occasionally, my mom would take me out to Davy's and we'd spend the weekend playing Mario Kart 64 and battling Pokemon on our Game Boys. One weekend, it'd been a few months since our last sleepover, I was excited to bring the new Pokemon Stadium that I'd rented from Blockbusters. Aunt Jenny lived in a trailer park. The inside of her home was spotless, but the park itself was a dump. None of her surrounding neighbors shared her enthusiasm for cleanliness. She was a neat freak. Davy and I were made to feel like nuisances, so when we weren't in his room, we'd usually be outside wandering the streets. This weekend, when I'd met up with him, he wasn't interested in playing Pokemon Stadium. Instead, he wanted me to meet his new friend that recently moved into the park. I was disappointed, to say the least, but I was at least hoping Davy's new friend would have shared the same interest or an endearing quality to discover. I couldn't have been more wrong. His name was Carson. He was a poster child for stereotypical broken home, trailer trash, if you will, a shining star for everything backwards in our country. There was a giant Confederate flag hanging over one of the windows, being used as curtains in his living room, clearly visible from the outside front porch. When we knocked, he answered the door with a lit cigarette in his mouth. Carson, 11, maybe 12, but he looks like he's pushing 30. He's tall, with long, straggly blonde hair, wearing a dirty shirt and saggy jeans. The inside of his trailer is dark and dirty, but we don't stay there for long. Eventually, we decide to walk to the mini-mart for snacks. He continues to smoke as we stroll next to him, lighting one cigarette with the last before stomping it out. Carson and Davy talk and joke while I pedal a couple of feet behind, but Carson stops and says, "Look at that," pointing to the recycling bin outside of a trailer we were passing. Sticking out of it was a PlayStation 1 box. He then casually leads us to the back of the trailer. I'm thinking that we're taking a shortcut out of the park, but we stop again. Carson puts out his cigarette and quietly steps onto the back porch of the trailer. He cups his hands and peers inside the windows. Nobody's home. I suggest that we head towards the mini-mart, but Davy just stands there, watching Carson as he opens the screen door and begins to visually measure the doggy door by his legs. After kicking the flap a few times, Carson gets on his hands and knees and starts to shimmy his way into the small doggy door. I'd never been in trouble in my life. Witnessing this brazen move instantly piqued my anxiety meter. I whisper to Davy that we shouldn't be doing this, but Davy says Carson does this all the time. So, I stand and watch as Carson pokes his head into the trailer through the little dog door flap. Once more, he leans out before putting his arms in a diving position and starts wiggling like a snake through the flap. When he gets both shoulders in, all we can see is his lower body outside of the door. Next, Davy and I hear a low growl from somewhere deep inside the trailer. Carson lets out a shriek as the growl turns into a vicious bark. Carson's legs start violently kicking, like he's trying to get back out. The sound of barking now becomes attack snarls. The shrieks change to sickening, desperate screams. We don't know what to do. A second loud burst of barks and growls add to the noise, and Davy says, "Holy shit, there's 2 of them in there." Neither of us move until we see Carson's flailing lower half start to get dragged inside the doggy door. That's when we both ran and grabbed his legs, trying to pull him out. Getting a steady grip on his legs was a struggle because of how much he was flipping around. It was like playing tug of war against these dogs for Carson. All the while he's screaming, and we can feel the wooden deck vibrate as these 2 huge animals bounce off the walls inside the trailer, continuing to maul his upper body. This must have lasted 45 seconds tops, but it felt like an hour had passed before we'd finally freed him from their grasp and pulled him fully out of the doggy door. The dogs let go of him. Davy and I fall backwards when the tension gives. I fall off the wooden porch steps and I land in the small backyard. From what I can see, Carson's a ripped up, bloody pulp, laying where we dropped him, and Davy's fall landed him up against the porch's wooden little fence. He's still on his feet, turning towards me and yelling to run as he tries to hop the wooden gate slats. I'm still trying to get my bearings as he starts dashing past me. Behind him is the biggest Rottweiler I've ever seen. It sprints past me and keeps chasing Davy. When I stand, I see the second Rottweiler, equally as big, and it's still attacking Carson. I was fearful the dog would redirect its attack at any moment. Before I panicked and ran, alerting the dog, a voice in my head told me to back away slowly. So, I keep my eyes on the dog. Every bite that it delivers is finished with a shake strong enough to lift Carson's body off the ground. When I got around to the front of the trailer, that's when I ran and started screaming for help. I didn't want to stop and bang on a trailer because I didn't know how far behind me those dogs could have been. Nobody opened up their door as I ran and screamed. I made it all the way back to Davy's place. When I got in, I frantically told Aunt Jenny what had happened. She called 911. Then she followed me as we ran back, retracing my steps to the trailer. Halfway there, we heard Davy hollering. We'd follow his voice to find him on top of a dumpster, kicking at a relentless Rottweiler attempting to jump at him. Aunt Jenny's motherly instincts kicked in, and she grabs a metal windsock rod from a nearby trailer, then rushes the dog and whips it with a lightning-sounding crack. The dog yips and runs away. Davy starts crying and falls into his mother's arms. By the time we get to Carson, he's still on the porch, unresponsive. The second dog is gone. Jenny slides a planter in front of the doggy door and starts CPR on Carson. She tells me to go out front and flag down the ambulance. Davy's in too much of hysterics to be of any use, so he stays with Jenny as I run back through the trailer park to direct the ambulance where to go. Thankfully, Davy didn't get caught by his pursuers, so he didn't have to go to the hospital. My mom drove out and picked me up that night after hearing what happened. That's also about the time Davy and I grew apart. My mom didn't let me go over there anymore, and before social media, it was hard to stay in contact past phone calls. I did find out that Carson survived. He had to have reconstructive surgery and lost one of his hands from the attack. I can't imagine what actually took place inside while we were trying to pull him out. The terror he must have felt. I just can't imagine. I'm the owner of a small-town bowling alley. I'm usually the last one to leave each night. There's a lot of history in that place. It's been open since the pins were reset manually. 2 people have actually died on the property. The most recent death happened 2 years ago when a senior citizen dropped dead on Lane 6, but the first one happened back in May of '73. Schools had just let out for the summer, and all the graduating seniors were getting their college acceptance or rejection letters. In other words, a bunch of couples were deciding whether or not they wanted to try long distance or call it quits. And most chose the latter. Well, you know how men can be. Some just can't handle rejection. The one we're talking about went by the name Porkchop. And that right there should tell you everything you need to know about him. Porkchop wasn't too happy that his girlfriend wanted to move 6 hours away for a major university, while he stayed here at the local community college. He just knew she'd find someone better, and I'm sure she would have. But he was one of those, if I can't have her, no one can types. He worked at the bowling alley, so he took that poor girl there after closing, did all sorts of things to her, ensuring she would never make it out alive. He buried the body somewhere outside of town, but she died right behind the counter. Some people think that she's the one responsible for the haunting. Others think that it's the previous owner because of the random cigar smells. He suffered a stroke at home in 2006. But he poured so much of himself into the business that folks like to think that that's where his soul settled. I personally believe all 3 candidates stuck around. I've seen too much to think otherwise. Minor things like the cigar smell, random cold spots, or small items falling over happen all the time, but the more blatant activity only occurs at night. I've had footsteps approach me from behind as I close the register. I've had pins fall over one after another, as if someone were knocking them down as they walked across the lanes. And I've caught a glimpse of shadow figures. But last week was the first time I heard a scream. I was just turning off the lights and heading towards the door when it happened. The short scream was filled with agony and desperation before ending abruptly, as if someone had clasped their hands over the woman's mouth. It was so quick that I immediately began to question. Was it my imagination? Logically, it felt like the obvious conclusion, but it was just so real. I was still on edge when I got home, so I told my family in hopes that they would offer an explanation, one I hadn't thought of. No such luck. They suggested I heard someone outside, but I'm positive it came from behind the register. I was only 10 to 15 feet away from it when it happened. It's hard to confuse that with something going on outside. Over the next few days, I gradually forgot about the incident and life went back to normal. Until Tuesday. I was alone once again, but it had been a quiet night, so my guard was completely down. When I was leaving, I noticed a child's ball sitting on the floor next to the ball return, but as I walked towards it, it slowly began to roll away. I watched as it curved ever so slightly to line up with the middle of lane 6 and continue all the way to the pins. It never picked up speed. It maintained the same crawling pace all the way till the end. Only a few pins were knocked over by the ball's path. But after it fell into the return, the remaining pins toppled over, one by one. So yeah, unless the man who died on lane 6 loved cigars as much as the previous owner, I think we may have 3 ghosts in this place. When I was really young, I used to see things that weren't there, quote unquote. Now, before you recommend a psychiatrist or anything like that, know that I've already had my fair share of testing. I'm sound of mind, and kind of most importantly, what I know I saw and experienced as a child, I haven't experienced anything like it since. It was always the same 2 individuals I'd see, as well as a dog. Well, half a dog anyway. Not as creepy as it sounds. there was a man. I mean, at first he was really just a shadow. I assumed he was a man because he towered over the other, and when he was around, it felt a lot like when my grandpa was around. A jolly, older spirit, for sure. I only ever saw him as a shadow man, but call it imagination or keen sense, I knew what he looked like. I knew that he was an old man that wore one of those hats that you'd see golfers wear sometimes, round and flat. He wore a sweater and had a long beard just like my grandpa. He wasn't mine, though. In fact, I think he was the grandfather of the other spirit I would see. When I would see them together, it was joyous and familial. The girl always seemed to be in or around my room, whereas Grandpa Spirit liked to hang out in the common areas, even outside sometimes. I didn't and don't know who these two really were, but I like to believe that they were something to each other. The younger spirit, again, I think she may have only been a shadow at first, like in reality, but in my mind I knew that she was about my age, a little younger. She had blonde hair, brown eyes, wore a light-colored pink or purple dress with white stockings. She liked when I would play with my dollhouse, and even when I wasn't playing with it, I would see her sitting with my dollhouse, one of those Fisher-Price ones. She was there, sometimes in the day, sometimes in the night, but I sensed that I always sort of felt their presence, if that makes sense. Okay, lastly, the half-dog. I say that because it always seemed to be rounding a corner. You could never really ever see more than its back hind legs or just the backside in general. I would chase it sometimes, but not once did I ever find anything around the corner. As a child, I remember thinking, silly boy. I guess where it all got a tad frightening for me was when my mother got uncomfortable, especially when I was asking her about the shadow people, the ones that lived in our house. She wasn't fond of me asking about the puppy either. Her uneasiness made me wary of my friends, but not really. It's where I think that kids have a sort of sixth sense. I continued seeing these friends or spirits until about the 4th grade. We moved out of that house a year later, but I remember thinking for a good time before that, I wonder where they went. I don't share these stories because I found these spirits harmful or scary, but because I genuinely want to know if others have had experiences like these, maybe specifically when you were a child. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me, whether it's your first time or you're a regular. Your support means the world over here. So, thanks so much for listening. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep your eyes open long enough to find those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks again to all of you for listening. A huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour, YT. Stay spooky.